Welcome to our final More Than the Score for 2021. It was a fast season. It went by very, very quickly. Hi, I'm Althea Brooks, and I'm Senior Director of Lifetime Learning in the Office of Engagement. And we partner with the Alumni Association to bring you More Than the Score each Saturday morning before a home football game. And special thanks to both of our teams that are working these fall Saturday mornings. They sacrifice time to be here for you, but we're glad to be here. We extend a special welcome to you, our in-person guests, as well as those online for the live stream. Thank you for being here today. We are thrilled to welcome Barbara Perry back to More Than the Score. Let's go ahead and give her an applause in advance. Barbara has spoken for us at least 4 or 5 times here at More Than the Score, and we're always delighted to have her back. So thank you, Barbara. She is a profound and engaging speaker. I'm sure you will agree. How many people have heard her before speak? There you go. How many Miller Center fans are in the audience? All right. Barbara, you also have a room full of students this morning. I don't know what brought them out. They're up early. They've got coffee and donuts, and they are here, so thanks for being here, students. The UVA bookstore is also here, and they will be selling Ms. Perry's book and her latest book, The Presidency, Facing Constitutional Crossroads. And these books make a wonderful Christmas gift. So I encourage you to get a few copies for friends. Before we begin, go ahead and silence the ringer on your phones. Please hold your questions to the end. We have microphones. There's one over here and one over here. Step up to the microphone, give your UVA affiliation, your name, and kindly only ask one brief question, please. And go ahead and keep your mask on as you ask that question. Now to introduce Barbara Perry. Barbara A. Perry is the Gerald L. Blouses Professor and Director of Presidential Studies at the University of Virginia's Miller Center, where she co-directs the Presidential Oral History Program. She has authored and edited 16 books on presidents, first ladies, the Kennedy family, the Supreme Court, civil rights, and civil liberties. Ms. Perry has conducted more than 120 interviews for the George H. Bush, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama presidential oral history projects. Additionally, Ms. Perry participated in the Bill Clinton interviews, directed the Edward Kennedy Oral History Project, and co-directs the Hillary Rodham Clinton Oral History Project. Ms. Perry served as a U.S. Supreme Court Fellow and has worked for Senate's Republican and Democratic members. Please help me thank and welcome Barbara Perry back to More Than the Score. Thanks, Barbara.
Well, thank you so much, Althea, for that very, very generous introduction. I so appreciate it and appreciate seeing all of you here today. I have to tell you how thrilled I am to be with you because this is my first in-person talk since March 2020. So thank you. And it was at my previous employer, Sweetbriar College, down the road, and it was in early March of 2020, and the next week everything shut down. So I've been doing everything online. So I want to say hello to those of you who are joining us online today, but a special welcome to those of you who are in person in the audience. And also a special thanks to Althea and Lifetime Learning staff for being here. I love working with them. I'm so happy to be, again, in person, seeing them, and hope that we can plan many more of these events. 2 of them that I've worked with Althea on that I especially loved. One was in Boston in 2017 for the commemoration of President Kennedy's 100th birthday. So we met with alums in New England and from the Boston area at the Kennedy Library and did a whole day long program there. And then, of course, my favorite was in my hometown of Louisville, Kentucky for the 2019 regionals. Anybody remember that? Those 2 basketball games? So I not only got to go to the basketball games in my hometown for my Who's, but I got to give a more than the score talk before those games. So it was really a thrill. So let's get started today on the presidency at the crossroads, and I'm going to call Althea back up, and she's going to get us to a little introductory video that the Miller Center did several years ago on this very topic, and then we'll get into the meat of my talk today.
The American presidency stands at a crossroads. Presidents must lead a diverse nation, navigate a partisan landscape, work with a divided Congress.
I'll be happy to, but you need to make sure the entire record is correct, Mr. Cummings.
And that's exactly what I want to do.
Well, then go ahead.
I'm about to tell you.
Manage world tensions, communicate through new and traditional media,
to anger people like you. Okay.
and unify a nation divided. Fortunately, Americans do not have just one president. We have had 45 administrations to learn from, each with a record of victories and defeats.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
From this one office come critical decisions that affect countless lives around the world. And shape the course of history.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
For more than 40 years, the University of Virginia's Miller Center has focused on the serious responsibilities of the presidency. Based at a university founded by Presidents Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, we connect the lessons of history to today's leadership challenges. Now we are embarking on an ambitious research agenda to study the modern presidency, from constitutional powers to policy challenges, to how the office represents the American people. How can 21st century presidents lead a system designed almost 250 years ago? How does a president decide when to go to war, administer justice, or take our economy forward? How can a president bring together a country often divided by region, race, and religion? We publish books, essays, and policy papers. We sponsor conferences and seminars and produce videos and documentaries. We use traditional and new media, and we speak directly to policymakers. Our experts in politics, law, history, and business work together with an unmatched network of former White House officials from both parties, and we engage with concerned citizens from across the country to lead our democracy forward. Together we frame and influence public debate through discovery and dialogue, not dogma or discord. We reveal what really happened behind closed doors in the presidencies of John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and Richard Nixon through our curation and analysis of the secret White House tapes.
I want it implemented on a thievery basis, not have to get in and get those files. Blow the safe, get it.
And our comprehensive oral histories for Presidents Carter, Reagan, Bush 41, Clinton, and Bush 43 capture critical memories and uncover new perspectives on historic events.
One of the real problems you have with any new administration, even one as experienced as ours was, is we weren't a bunch of amateurs. We'd been around there before.
The Miller Center brings the lessons of history to life and connects the past to the future.
Well, that will give you a little sense of where we're going today with this topic. You might have recognized the famous voice of Ann Compton, 30 some odd years as the White House correspondent, and happily she served on our board for 2 terms at the Miller Center. Has just stepped off, but we're going to continue to work with her. In fact, I just sent her an invitation to do an oral history with us because she has reported on the White House for 7 some odd terms. Well, let's start then with our first slide. And when you think of this metaphor of the presidency at a crossroads, I just couldn't help but think about presidents in different means of conveyance, of transportation. So when you go back to George Washington, it's obviously on horseback. And if you read about George Washington, I'm thinking of Richard Brookhiser's book on George Washington and leadership, for example. He said he was among the tallest members of his generation, you know, well over 6 feet tall, when that was not the average height of an American man. But he was rather narrow of shoulder, so he would have his uniforms made specially with big wide epaulets to make his shoulders look wider. And then they said nobody rode a horse with more authority or stood on a horse and just stood stock still. And it would make the men he was commanding really look up to him and certainly respect him. Obviously, when cars come along, presidents can get out and about more easily, as Woodrow Wilson, you see here in the top right, was actually able to parade through the streets. When he went out into the countryside after the Treaty of Versailles was signed over in France, he came back and went all over the country to try to gin up the American people to tell the Senate to go ahead and ratify. Well, we know he failed at that, but this was his ability to reach out to the American people. And then I couldn't help this almost boyish-like picture of President Trump in a truck that they brought to the White House, and I just kept thinking of my brother, who loved cars and trucks and would run them around the house, but he just looked so happy to be there and so passionate about it. But now we come from the mode of transportation to the metaphor itself of the crossroads. And so as I began to think about this topic, as the Miller Center began this years-long project on the presidency at the crossroads, and that led to this book that we did, I thought, well, what would a crossroads look like? So I came up with these different images. So if you start with the top left, you can see that it could be a wide spot in the road. You know, people say a small town is a wide spot in the road. Well, it could be out in the countryside. It could be a rural destination where two dirt roads meet. But if you're a president, you come to that spot and you have to make a choice. Are you going to go left or right or center? Sort of interesting, isn't it, when we think of the spectrum that way? Or are you going to go backwards? That could be the turn around, the U-turn. So the bottom picture on the left is that could you go backwards? Sometimes that's not a bad thing if we want to go back to values that we have and we feel like we've lost touch with. Then how about the top right-hand side, the famous fork in the road? You know, Yogi Berra said, and come to a fork in the road, take it. But you know, presidents, if they come to two choices, are going to have to decide. Do they go, in this case, left or right? Again, sort of an interesting analogy to the spectrum. But in some ways, my favorite metaphor for the crossroads is the one at the bottom right. And that's because when you think about interstate highways intersecting from the era of the Eisenhower years of building the interstate highway system, I know in Northern Virginia, how many of you are from Nova? If you're from Northern Virginia, you know the mixing bowl, right? Where all of the, yes, we're shaking our head, you know, where all of the interstate highways intersect. In Louisville, where this happens near downtown, where all the interstates come together, they call it Spaghetti Junction. And there are many, many wrecks there because it's hard to navigate. Again, most of the things that come to presidents are not going to look like the first three pictures. They're going to be complicated, like the bottom right-hand side, so that presidents not only can make great decisions, but sometimes they can, if you will, have a wreck. I also remember as I began to learn how to drive, and I was talking to George before we began today, and we were talking about where we were from. He said he was from Buffalo. I said, oh, snow country. And he said, where are you from? I said, Louisville, Kentucky. Same exact latitude as Charlottesville. And pretty much same climate. So we have a fair amount of snow. So when I learned to drive, my dad taught me that old saying, turn in the direction of the skid. Okay, I'm a little directionally challenged, and that just made no sense to me. I just couldn't comprehend that. I tried as best I could. I think now they've updated that to turn the wheel in the direction you want the car to go, which apparently turns out to be the same as turn in the direction of the skid, but it makes more intuitive sense, so I'm being better about this. But we know that if we make a wrong turn, if we slam on the brakes, if we don't negotiate the snow and the ice correctly, we could wind up in the ditch, and we certainly don't want the country to be there. So let's talk about specifically where presidents have faced the most difficult crossroads, where they have had the most difficult decisions to make, where there was the most at stake. Sometimes, in really most of these cases, the very lifeblood of the country was at stake. Would we continue as a country? And sometimes while we think of George Washington as a great president, by the way, of the 4 I list here, having to make decisions at the crossroads, 3 of those 4 are considered by all scholars to be the top 3 greatest presidents, Washington, Lincoln, and FDR. And that's because they negotiated these difficult constitutional crossroads. And even though we think of Washington as great as the first president, the father of our country, the leader of the revolution, as the general, the commanding general, but I think sometimes we lose sight of the fact that it wasn't a sure thing that this country would last beyond the founding. So he had to make sure that we were on the right road, if you will, make the right constitutional decisions. So there were some that were actually not written in the Constitution that he made a decision about to increase in his mind, our democracy by deciding to step aside after 2 terms. So he retired and went back to be with Martha at Mount Vernon, and sadly didn't live too much longer beyond that. But that's where the 2-term precedent came in until the constitutional amendment in the 50s to make sure that presidents could only serve 2 terms. But he also had these precedents such as executive privilege. We're beginning to hear a lot about that again. You might know from yesterday's news about the 1-6 committee at Congress calling, subpoenaing people to come before them, and many people who worked in the Trump administration saying, oh, no, I'm protected by executive privilege. That is not in the Constitution, so that's a precedent that was set by Washington. Just one example of a crossroads he came to. Another example, and certainly expands our democratic republic, is the Jacksonian era of the 1830s. And this is at a time when the franchise expands. Now, it doesn't sound very expansive to our modern ears because only white men were still allowed to vote. But the main difference in the Jacksonian period was expanding the franchise to non-propertied white men. So up to that point, from the founding to the 1830s, only white men with property could vote. So you can imagine the expansion that brings to power somebody like Jackson, who was really our first populist president. You know, the rough and tumble Andrew Jackson from the frontier of Tennessee, but the great general hero of the War of 1812. But he certainly opens up the democratic republic. So at that democratic crossroads, he expands the votes, the number of people who could vote. Let me go back then to Lincoln. This clearly is like the founding period in the sense that if he didn't make the right decisions as the country split apart, so the most difficult crisis ever a president to face, and let us hope we don't ever face that again, but as soon as he's elected, states from the South begin to secede. And so he has to make the right choices to get us through the Civil War, to have the Union win the Civil War, to hold on to the Union, to bring the Southern states back in to the Union, and of course to abolish slavery through the 13th Amendment, a constitutional amendment. And then in the case of FDR, he must have thought, what had he done wrong in his life to have ended up with 2 crises, both worldwide? The Great Depression wasn't just in the United States, it was a worldwide depression. And in this country, when he came into office in March actually was the last time in 1933 that we held an inauguration in March instead of January. So when he comes in March of 33, 25% of the American people are out of work. Unemployment rate was 25%. People were losing their homes, their farms. There was a climate crisis, the Great Dust Bowl of the Midwest. So he had to try to right the ship immediately, economically, and also give people hope that there was something more that could be done for them. And that's where we get, of course, the New Deal. And it is also the expansion of the power of the presidency, the power of the executive branch. So at that crossroads, he chooses to expand the role of the federal government, the power of the president, the power of the executive office, the executive branch of government. And we've not really ever stepped back from that, have we? Then, on just about as we're coming out of the Great Depression, World War II hits. We are, of course, bombed into war in 1941 in December of that year. It'll be 80 years ago in a few weeks' time that we'll look back to Pearl Harbor. But it's at that point then, of course, that he goes before Congress and declares December 7th, 1941 as a day that will live in infamy. And again, thank goodness for that leadership that he gave us on the world stage and with the Allies to defeat fascism. So now this is the students. Who are the students out there today? Good for you. I am so impressed because, you know, typically I'm not up this early on a Saturday morning. I'm still on student time, apparently. This is why I became a professor, by the way. My friends know this to be true. They say, you just got a PhD so you could sleep late. I say, yes, thank you for telling me that. So this is the really scholarly nub or core of the talk today. And that is that a professor at the University of Texas, who is both a political scientist and a law scholar, came up with this idea that he calls the two constitutional presidencies. And I ask you to think of the word constitutional here as not a yes or no or right or wrong definition of constitutional, but more generically. That is, two ways of looking at the Constitution and the presidency. So not like when the Supreme Court says this law is constitutional or this law is unconstitutional. So don't think of it as right or wrong, but just simply two ways to look at the presidency in the Constitution or beyond it. So the first one is literally looking at the Constitution and how the founders at Philadelphia in 1787 wrote the second article of the Constitution to spell out the powers of the presidency. So what Tula says is, this is our first constitutional presidency, and it is when you can think in terms of the formal powers of the presidency, but also with the checks and balances of being part of a separation of powers and part of three branches of government, but also part of a federal structure where you have national government, state governments, and local governments. And you have these checks on the people, because the founders wanted a republic, not a direct democracy. They did not want we, the people, to be making the decisions. They wanted us to pick representatives, thus the term republic. So they worried even at that, and even when they were only allowing white male property owners to vote, they still developed electoral college, right, to check the popular vote. Things like veto power. So president has the power to veto, but Congress can override those vetoes. So there are all these checks and balances. Judicial review, that is not in the Constitution. You can't find that wording in the Constitution, but the Supreme Court took that role on in the early 1800s in order to determine whether a law is constitutional or not, or whether the action by for anybody from a police officer in the street up to the President of the United States has acted constitutionally or not. And finally, through these limits on suffrage that up until fairly recently we had, so that now everybody 18 years old and older technically can vote. But that's a very modern expansion as well. So that's pretty simple to comprehend, I think, the formal sense of the presidential office in the Constitution. But now, Tula says, if you look, starting with Woodrow Wilson, and go back to Woodrow Wilson in the open car, going around the country trying to get people to write to their members of the Senate and say, ratify the Treaty of Versailles. Woodrow Wilson, who, as we know, had some connection to this university, he was the only PhD president we've had. Anybody know what his PhD was in? Political science. Pretty helpful, isn't it, for a president, right, to have a political science PhD? Johns Hopkins, by the way, was where his PhD was from, and he ended up being the president of Princeton prior to becoming president. But he had this view that he could convince the people directly through his rhetoric, through his speeches. So hold that thought, because that is going to lead us now into the modern presidency. So according to Toulis, you start with this popular presidency, this president reaching out to the people directly through speeches, but also note when this is happening. Wilson was president from 1913 to 1921. The automobile comes online, train travel is much easier, he was able to get around the country, media is able, so his speeches, he doesn't have to just give speeches directly to people in person, he can get them out and spread out through the media. So he can literally directly reach the people almost in real time. That's very different from presidents before that. Well, now you go to the next level with FDR and the mass media presidency, because he masters the new technology of radio. the famous fireside addresses, the speeches to the American people, the speeches to Congress that are now broadcast on radio. So he enters into another phase where he reaches the people directly. And you might have heard that story that when he died in April of 1945 and his body was brought back from Warren Springs to Washington and it was taken through the streets to the White House from Union Station on a military caisson, and the story goes that a woman was weeping. There were lots of pictures of people weeping in the streets of Washington as his coffin passed by. And someone said to the woman, "Did you know him?" And she said, "No, but he knew me." That is a very personal bond, isn't it, between the people and the president that couldn't happen in the earlier parts of our republic because it was harder for presidents to meet the people where they were. Then you get the next technological shift, which is television. All right, Kennedy's not the first president to be on television. In fact, Harry Truman did a tour of the refurbished White House with Walter Cronkite on television in the late 40s, early 50s. And of course, Eisenhower was on television. But think of this statistic. In 1952, when Eisenhower was elected to the first term, only 20% of American households had televisions. By 1960, when Kennedy was elected, that was up to 80 or 90%. And he was the perfect television president. The youngest president ever elected. His dad had been in movies going back to the 1920s. His dad produced movies. The family was famous long before he became president. They had been on newsreels. They knew how to use the media. And so President Kennedy not only knew how to use the media, but he used it in a different way. He gave live press conferences in prime time on television. And there's a gentleman here in town named John Davis who was a young Foreign Service officer at this time, and he told me a story that he said, we were in the State Department, and you'll see this picture here in the middle. This is in the State Department auditorium. That was where it was big enough to get all the media in and anybody who wanted to watch. So John said, this was the best entertainment in Washington. We'd go and sit in the back of the auditorium and listen to President Kennedy because he was a master of facts, he was a master at dealing with the media, he was friends with a lot of the media, and he had a great sense of humor. So it was great entertainment. Well, then who's the next president who can do that as well? But literally a celebrity, a Hollywood celebrity president. We had celebrity presidents in terms of war heroes, but not media celebrities, not Hollywood celebrities. And so before he became governor of California, Ronald Reagan was a celebrity, a Hollywood actor who played famously the Gipper, George Gipp, in the movie about, do I dare say Notre Dame, about Notre Dame's Newt Rockne, the great football coach. So he earned that nickname, the Gipper. And the famous scene in that movie is George Gipp, true story, lying on his deathbed, dying of pneumonia, and Newt Rockne comes in to try to bolster his spirits, and the famous phrase of Ronald Reagan as George Gipp is, you know, someday, coach, when the boys are down and the odds are against us, tell them to go out there and just win one for the Gipper. And Ronald Reagan sort of rode that image of the great hero all the way to the White House and beyond. So now I'm going to ask you this question of the day. Have we entered a third phase of the presidency that, following Toulouse, I'll say, follows into the third constitutional presidency, another way to look at the presidency? Because new things are happening since these four presidents I've just profiled, okay? So one is, we know we have 24/7 media. God help us. You can turn on your television or go to your computer or go to your phone at any time and you will find news. Whether you think that is fake or partisan or you have a favorite channel that you like, but think back to those Kennedy years. Everybody was watching Kennedy because there were only 2 or 3 or at the most 4 channels on anybody's television. And I remember our 1950s television in our living room only got 2 channels because we didn't have the band that got ABC. So we had CBS and NBC. So if you were a president who went on TV, if anybody wanted to watch TV, they were going to be watching you. So now we have this amazing proliferation of 24/7 media outlets and coverage, on top of which the layer of social media, which I think is a misnomer because media or medium literally means in the middle, right? The mainstream media, the traditional media, are between us and the government. In social media, we are the media, thus the misnomer. There's nothing between now the people and the government. There's nothing between the people and the president, since that's what we're talking about. And we've had another celebrity president, right? So we've had President Trump came to power mostly because of his television persona. And so he was another TV, in this case, TV celebrity. What are the other factors that are happening at the same time as these media changes and the types of people we're electing to be president? We have universal suffrage. So that means that in addition now to we the people being the media on social media, everybody in theory 18 years old and older can vote. So that means that there are a lot more people to reach, but it means there are a lot more people to reach, right? And get them on your side if you can. That means populism, reaching out to the people. And populism, by the way, by definition, doesn't mean just reaching the people. But usually populism means a popular sentiment that is against elites. It can be right-wing populism, it can be left-wing populism. But whether it's on left or right, populists and those who reach out to them typically are anti-elites. That is anti-elites in the government, anti-elites in business, anti-elites in the media. And we see a wave of that currently right now in the United States and around the world. And by the way, that's what my chapter is about in this book. The mediating institutions are failing. So media itself is losing power because of social media. So that mediating institution that's supposed to filter our views up to government, that's beginning to diminish. The government itself, in some ways, some people think is weakening. Religions are weakening. Churches are weakening. We have a situation where political parties are beginning to weaken. So those things that were meant to kind of filter out the worst of the people's views and the passions of the people, as the founders called them, are beginning to fail. That means, again, people are directly relating to the president. Also now, coming in the other direction because of social media and 24/7 media, the president can reach the people at any time. So the metaphor that I use, or the analogy that I use, is that, anybody know how many fireside chats FDR did from 1933 to when he died in 45? We hear about them all the time, so we think every week he must have been doing a fireside chat. He only did 30 in all those years, 12 years as president. John Kennedy did more in the way of press conferences than typically we have now among presidents, but he still limited those to about 2 a month. So it wasn't like social media where you would have a hot microphone in the Oval Office, and anytime John Kennedy or FDR or Ronald Reagan, and Ronald Reagan had, by the way, broken into celebrityhood as a radio announcer, you might know. One of his first jobs was announcing baseball in Iowa on the radio. But Ronald Reagan didn't have a hot mic in the Oval Office, and every time he had an idea, say, okay, American people, here's my idea. Very different from the use of Twitter, as an example. And finally, populism often takes hold when a president gins up divisions among the people, or at least divisions between the people and the elites. So now we're coming to an important definition for today, which is the definition of a demagogue. And this was something the founders so feared. And it wasn't just in the 1700s, but the concept goes back to ancient Greece. In Athens, which was a direct democracy, the people did make the laws. They did make the policies. They didn't have representatives. But the ancient Athenians realized that occasionally you could get a person who was up to no good, who would sway those people and they'd make bad judgments. Our founders feared that, even in a republic. So they feared that among the people there could be a demagogue, and worst of all, the people in electing their representatives could elect a demagogue. So here's the definition that I have taken from the American Political Dictionary, and it was published in 1989. Here we go. Demagogue, this is the quotation as the definition: an unscrupulous politician who seeks to win and hold office through emotional appeals to mass prejudices and passions. That's that direct connection to the people. Half-truths, outright lies may be used in attempts to dupe the voters. Typically, a demagogue may try to win support from one group by blaming another for its misfortunes. And George and I were talking before the program today about Hitler, scapegoating Jews, for example, and communists, and labor leaders, and homosexuals, and single women, by the way, were viewed as defective. Eventually, all those people were rounded, gypsies, rounded up, put in camps, and exterminated to the tune of some 6 million people lost in the Holocaust. So we have had demagogues in this country. We haven't escaped that phenomenon. The founders were right that whenever you have masses of people, you're going to have demagogues. It's just part of the human condition. And so I've picked out some of the most recent. Huey Long in the 1930s on the left, left-wing populist, ginning up left-wing populism against Washington, against the elites. He so aroused the passions of the people, he was assassinated in Louisiana. Father Coughlin, the radio priest, on the right, ginned up passions among right-wing conservative Roman Catholics in this country in his radio addresses from Detroit that went around the country in the 1930s and 40s. And then more recently, Joe McCarthy, who was such a demagogue that he lent his name, McCarthyism, to an entire era of the 50s in his witch hunting and red baiting in Congress. So we've had them, but these three did not become president. And of course now, given Hamilton and its success on Broadway and around the country as a play through Lin-Manuel Miranda, we must always quote Hamilton. So in the Federalist Papers, the very first one, and the Federalist Papers were actually newspaper editorials that the three of the founders, Hamilton, John Jay, who would go on to become the first Chief Justice of the United States, and James Madison, the father of the Constitution, wrote these editorials between when they had finished writing the Constitution in 1787 and that it was being considered throughout the states for ratification. So these were papers that they would put into, op-eds they would put into the newspapers of the day under the pen name Publius. In the very first one, this is what Hamilton said about demagogues. Of those men who have overturned the liberties of republics, the greatest number have begun their career by paying an obsequious court to the people, commencing as demagogues and ending as tyrants. And so I just had to stop and think about that definition and look at the images of January the 6th, 2021 in this country. I just find it, particularly since, as Althea said, I've worked on Capitol Hill, I've strolled through those, in my view, hallowed halls of Congress and hallowed halls of the White House, for that matter, on tours, and hallowed halls of the Supreme Court where I worked. And it just hurt my heart to see what was happening that day in terms of the violence, and especially this picture of the gallows that was built, and then this amazing photograph taken of the Capitol framed by that gallows, which, would have been bad enough, except that some of the people who were there were shouting, "Hang Mike Pence." So it seems to be a pretty clear connection there between the two. And so I think one has to think about the Hamiltonian definition in light of what is happening today. So I don't have the answers, but I have lots of questions for you to take away today before you pose your questions to me. My questions for you are the following. Where is the presidency headed as an institution? Where are the people who are running for president headed? Where are the people who have been presidents? Where are they headed? Has the founders' formal office been overtaken by this rhetorical presidency and maybe by a third category of a demagogic presidency? If not, if you don't think there's a problem there, which you're welcome to believe, if not, is the original constitutional structure, that first constitutional presidency, as Toulis calls it, that's spelled out in the Constitution, is that strong enough to withstand these modern developments that I've explained to you today? The changes in government, the changes in politics, the changes in the electorate, the changes in suffrage, the changes in the media, social media. Or if so, if you do believe that we are going down a pretty bad road, that we've chosen the wrong crossroads, or that presidents have taken the wrong turn, if that's the case, can we get back to the founders' original plan for the Constitution? And so how is the Miller Center attempting to answer these questions? Well, you heard Ann Compton in the video. But one way has been through gatherings like the Presidential Ideas Festival, or as we called it, PresFest. Was anyone able to go to that in 2019? It was an amazing, amazing event. And we have it on the Miller Center website. We invited people from both sides of the spectrum, both parties, nonpartisans, bipartisans, partisans, to come to the university and speak. And we ended with a keynote address by President Clinton, who spoke on the theme of the more perfect union. How have presidents been able to create a more perfect union? Sometimes they've succeeded and sometimes they've failed. And that has made such an impact that he's doing a partnership with the History Channel to do 6 features, documentaries on that topic. And I was really excited to be invited to New York this summer to work on 2 of those about various presidents and, again, successes and failures at making us a more perfect union. But you can watch those clips that have been curated by the Miller Center. And then we also have a project that we started in 2016 and 17, knowing we were going to have a new president in 2017. It's called First Year. And that is, what is the first year of presidents like? What has it been like in history? And we will be doing programs. By the way, students, my boss, director at the Miller Center, Bill Antholis, is teaching an undergraduate course in Washington in January on the first year of the Biden administration. And so see if you can sign up for that. It's going to be great. And we will have programs for the public as well around that we will do in person and in hybrid form. Obviously, then this book, Facing Constitutional Crossroads, is where we're headed as well with this topic. And I'd be happy to sign any books that you might have today, not only for Christmas gifts, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, and even Thanksgiving, I think. So, and speaking of Thanksgiving, thank you so much for your patience today and for your attention. I so appreciate it. I'm happy to take your questions, and Althea also sent about 14 questions from those who are watching today online. So if we run out of questions in person, I'll turn to those as well. So please come to the microphone. If you're not able to get to the microphone, shout out your question and I will repeat them for those who are here today. Don't be shy. Yes.
All right, yes. I was wondering your opinion on our two-party system.
Can you get closer to the microphone, and you'll have to speak quite loudly because we have to be masked.
Okay. Is this better? Okay, great. I was wondering your opinion on the two-party system and how that might play into any of this, and if you think that the two-party system makes it easier for an extremist to take office.
Great question, and that was one of the questions that was handed in by those who are watching online, so thank you for that. So the question is, what is the situation with our two-party system, and does the two-party system perhaps lend itself or contribute to the possibility that an extremist could be elected to the presidency? So let's back up a little history of two parties in this country. The founders were suspicious of political parties because they were suspicious of what they called factions. So any of you who've taken Political Science 101 or Introduction to American Government probably read Federalist Paper number 10 by James Madison. And in it, he talks about factions, and he defines them as divisions among the people that lead to negative outcomes. So in his mind, in the mind of the framers, all factions were bad. Now, we might call those today interest groups, but certainly parties are factions. And that is human nature, is it not? I mean, we're a faction today. Look at us all in our orange and blue. Our faction is, we're who's? We're Cavaliers, all right? So that's a faction. Our religious backgrounds, where we come from, our socioeconomic class, all of those things tend to lend themselves to people forming into groups of like people. And we see that especially today, right? We call this the great self-sort. People are sorting themselves into these groups. So what did the founders say? Well, here's one way to get rid of factions or political parties. Ban people from getting into factions. Just say you may not get into a group, okay? And the example, though, that Madison used was, what do you need to have fire? Fire is bad, but what do you need to have fire? Oxygen, right? If you don't have oxygen, you take a candle snuffer, put it over the flame goes out because it's deprived of oxygen. So he said, well, we could get rid of fire. And you imagine at the founding period how bad fires were. The Great Fire of London had happened in the 1600s and Great Fire of Chicago was, but I mean, fire was really worrisome. It was like the Wicked Witch and the Wizard of Oz. Everybody was afraid of fire. So he said, we could get rid of fire, just get rid of oxygen. Well, that would kill everyone. So his point was, you don't want to get rid of factions by getting rid of liberty. That's what we're trying to protect. So he said, how about this? Let as many factions as possible develop, and then they'll counter each other, and we have majority rule. So you'll have to have lots of factions come together to form a majority, and so you'll get compromise. And so what he called it was the extent and proper structure of the government and the country. So make the country as big as possible, and then you have as many factions, it's less likely that one big faction will develop. So that's one thing about parties, that they feared them. They don't talk about them in the Constitution. There is not one mention of political parties in the Constitution. And so they so feared them, and they so didn't want them, and they so didn't talk about them in the Constitution, that what happened when they walked out of Constitution Hall in Philadelphia? They divided into two parties, the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist. The Federalists were for the Constitution, the Anti-Federalists were against it, and they fought all over the country in every state, in every ratifying convention of every state. And from those two, Federalists and Anti-Federalists, develop the two parties that we ultimately know today, eventually, as Democrats and Republicans, with the slightly newer Republican Party developing around the Civil War period in the 1850s as being opposed to slavery. So what does that lead to? So that leads to two choices typically. What if you're an independent? In some states like my home state of Kentucky that has closed primaries, if you register as an independent, you cannot vote in a primary, because you have to be registered as a Democrat or a Republican. It also means that our system has developed as a two-party system, which is called winner-take-all. So if you are running in most states for governor, or if you're running in most states for Congress or Senate, whoever gets the most votes wins. We don't have any kind of system as they do in parliamentary systems, where if you're a minor party and let's say you get 10% of the votes across the country, you get 10% of the seats in parliament. We don't have that. So I think your point of your second question was, can that lead to extremism? I think that's a good point to raise, that if you only have two choices and one of those people is extreme or demagogic or bad for the country, and you end up with either a majority of those people voting for that person in the popular vote, or as we've had happen now twice since 2000, where the winner of the popular vote by millions of votes does not win the Electoral College, you could end up with someone who's not viewed by the people as being the better person. So you're onto something there, absolutely. Do I ever see it changing? Not unless we would completely change the structure of our system so that it wouldn't be this winner-take-all possibility. So we have such an ingrained sense of binary two parties that I don't know where we'd even start to try to get into a third party. That doesn't mean that a third party couldn't develop as the Republican Party did in the 1850s and eventually become one of the two major parties. That's unlikely, but it could happen. Other questions? Yes.
Yes, I'm intrigued by the metaphor of crossroads.
Okay.
And I'm wondering if you could comment on another type of crossroad, and that's the circle. Because it seems more and more we're in these circles and trying to figure which way to go, but we keep going around and around.
All right, I'm going to add that picture to this slide. That is excellent. Because aren't you noticed, roundabouts, as they call them in England, rotaries, I think they call them up in New England. Because I keep noticing more and more of those in Charlottesville. Have you all? And so far, they're not where there's a lot of traffic yet. I noticed when I was coming from Whole Foods the other day, coming back, I live in the Green Bar neighborhood, and I'm always a little put off by them because I'm just unused to them. But I can remember my civics teacher in high school saying, "Oh my gosh, I got on one of those roundabouts in Boston and I couldn't get off," she said, because there was so much traffic. Or DuPont Circle is another one in Washington. So it's a great metaphor, number one, just to think in terms of they're hard to negotiate. So they do go along with the spaghetti junction mixing bowl, that is the kind of thing that most presidents have to deal with, the difficult issues. As they say, if it's an easy issue, somebody down below the president has decided it. So it's the old Harry Truman sign, the buck stops here. Not only does the president have to make these hard decisions, but he, and someday we hope she, will have to live with the consequences. But I also like that part of the metaphor that you explained, that we sometimes feel like a hamster on a wheel, that we can't get out of a situation that doesn't feel right to us. And back then to the situation of we only have really two choices when it comes to a presidential election because we have this two-party system. So what if you have a person who's already in office, who's an incumbent, and you don't like the wheel that we're on, and you want to get off, then you've only got one other choice. And so it does mean that at least in the primary system, which in and of itself has difficulties, one of the questions that came from our online audience for today was, hasn't the primary system given us, maybe led us more towards the demagogic candidate, because it used to be that the parties chose the candidates. But as we've become more democratic, small d, more open to the people, more populist, we know that certainly in the 20th century is when primaries began. They go all the way back to 1912, but there were only a few of them around the country. So for example, when John Kennedy ran in 1960, he entered, I think, a total of about 8 primaries. But he picked them carefully because he knew he had to win, particularly in West Virginia. As a Catholic, he needed to win a Protestant state, and he won it over Humphrey. But it says to us, all of these massive numbers of people, you look at those first primary element debates where we've got 15 people on stage, or we've got so many people we can't get 15 people on stage, so we have to have 2 nights of debates with 8 people on the stage at a time. We have to be super careful about the people who are being drawn into those primaries and the people we're voting for in those primaries. At least that gives us a broader range of people for whom to vote. So I think that's good news. But in terms of just being on the wheel, the hamster wheel, and going around and around, it is up to us, it's up to we the people to make those changes. And let's think about that. Somebody else wrote in a question, how have presidents expanded our democracy? When they come to a crossroads of whether can we expand our democracy, and typically we have thought of that as creating a more perfect union, to use Bill Clinton's commentary about that. So someone wrote in and said, how have presidents done that? Well, I would point to someone like Lyndon Johnson signing the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which required that even private businesses, if they engage in interstate commerce, which can be regulated by Congress, must be integrated. So no more Jim Crow in private businesses, particularly throughout the South. That would be an expansion of democracy, an expansion of bringing people into the system, and even more to the point, the 65 Voting Rights Act. So to try to make sure that people, no matter their color, their race, were allowed to vote and not prevented from doing so. If you are on the other side of the political spectrum, we were talking again beforehand about favorite presidents or presidents we respect, and the name Ronald Reagan was brought up. So if you believe in small government, so particularly small federal government, remember his famous line from his first inaugural as he comes into office in the midst of a very bad economic situation. And I saw that yesterday the inflation rate came out. Anybody know what it is? Yeah, it's over 6% now. I remember in the Carter years when it was 15, 16, 17%, which was really bad if you needed to buy something, was really bad if you wanted a mortgage that was going to be 15% interest. But if you were an investor, oh my God, my dad made a killing in CDs. He took his little nest egg at retirement and put it into 10-year CDs at 15% return and got all the principal back in 15%. But, it is definitely inching up. So Ronald Reagan said in his first inaugural address, in the current instance, he said, in the current government crisis, not to mention the Iranian hostage crisis, but he said in the current instance, government isn't the solution to the problem. Government is the problem. So if you are a Reagan conservative and you see big government as actually a challenge to democracy and a challenge to liberty, and you want lower taxes and less government, then that's an example of a president who's attempting to create a more perfect union. Any other questions? I think how are we doing on time, Althea? Okay. Have time for 1 or 2 more? Yes, please.
Yeah, so this begins with a bit of like a tangent. In 1972, George McGovern's campaign suffered a lot as a result of unions hesitating to endorse him because they thought his 1968 primary reform basically removed their voice from the process. He actually said, "I opened the door of the Democratic Party and 20 million people walked out." But do you think that devolving stakeholder power in primaries from things that are traditionally viewed as engines of corruption, like big unions and political machines, can actually be bad for democracy because you pass the buck to overly partisan or disinterested primary voters who don't really have a meaningful level of awareness about the issues?
Yeah, a great and detailed question, a very knowledgeable and informed one about 1968-72, that period about unions particularly is fascinating to me, because one of the reasons as well that in 1972 that unions certainly marched away, voted with their feet away from the Democratic ticket led by George McGovern, is that unions, while they had been part of the great New Deal coalition that FDR put together, and that was the amazing thing about FDR, that he was able to bring together in his own party members of the South delegation in the Congress. They were, many of them, white supremacists, segregationists, and he was able to hold on to them, oftentimes by not doing things like supporting the anti-lynching bill, to Eleanor's upset, but he was able to bring together unions, Southerners, Jews, Catholics, women, blacks, minorities, but that began to split up in the 1960s for the very reason I just suggested, LBJ signing the 64 Civil Rights Act and the 65 Voting Rights Act. By 68, you have the Southern strategy of Richard Nixon, law and order, which appealed to a lot of blue-collar workers who were union members, blue-collar ethnics in Buffalo, for example, Polish ethnic workers, Catholic workers. They were called the silent majority. So that was wasn't just primaries, but that was another reason, was where the Democratic Party had gone. They felt it had abandoned them, and so they began to vote. They would call them Reagan Democrats. And they voted for Reagan, they voted for Nixon, many of them, for the first time in 68, and held on and are still now in the Republican Party, most of them. And of course, as you probably know, because it sounds like you've studied unions, unions have certainly diminished in their strength and in their numbers. Most of and not only that, but we've lost so many manufacturing jobs in this country, which was the lifeblood of unions. They still can be powerful in the automotive industry, to some extent in the coal mining industry, but the economy has changed so much that we just have so many fewer blue-collar workers. Now we have white-collar unions. Public workers, for example, are in unions. So with that, I'm going to take one more question from the online people. This was just a dagger to my heart as a Louisville Cardinal first, and a Who. When I'm just with the Who's, I'm with the Who's, but when they play, I have to be for Louisville, because it's not just my alma mater, it's my hometown team that I supported since I was 10, and told my parents when I was 10 that's what I wanted for my birthday in January, was 2 tickets to a Louisville basketball game. So here's the question. How did I feel when the Louisville kicker missed the kick to give the mighty Who's the 34-33 victory over the Louisville Cardinals? But see, this person doesn't know me. I can't watch my teams in real time. I record basketball and football games, and then when the Who's win and when the Cards win, then I watch. If they lose, I delete, and that's it. So thank you all so much.
Thank you so much. On behalf of Lifetime Learning and the Alumni Association, we have a small gift for you, so thank you.
Thank you so much. And it's small but heavy, so small but fine. Thank you again. Thank you, Althea. Thank you to Lifetime Learning, and thank you to all you. Go Who's tonight. Beat up on those Irish.
Thank you all for supporting More Than the Score. We've got the bookstore up here. Stop by and get a book, and enjoy the game. Go Who's.